Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Interdisciplinary and Trans-Disciplinary Studies, SOITS, Master of Arts, MA in Folklore and Culture Studies, MAFCS. Second year, MFC 007 Theories and Pedagogy of Folklore. Block 1 Polygenetic Theories of Folklore. Unit-2 Myth Ritual Theory. 2.0 Objectives. After reading this unit you will be able to have a clear idea about the chronological development of the myth ritual theory over the last 2 centuries both in Europe and America. Understand how the concept of myth and ritual have been put against the concept of regional identity and how scholars across centuries have tried to find out the hidden relation of religion with these 2 crucial attributes of society, i.e., myth and religion. Learn the nature of conceptual correlations between myth and ritual and how this relationship has been measured by experts in shaping up theories for interpretation of myths and rituals. Explore the nature of mutual dependency between the 2 social traditions, and how their mutual dependency reciprocally contributes to each other to grow with varied societal implications, and gain knowledge about the impacts of myths and rituals in societies, both primitive and modern, and how these practices of myths and rituals, as per the beliefs of the practitioners, can alleviate or protect societies from being affected by curses and evils. 2.1 Introduction. We as folklorists are greatly interested in the culture and heritage of a community. Hence we cannot ignore the study of religion and its 2 main components, i.e., myth and ritual. Hence in this unit, you will study the relationship between these 2 aspects of religion in detail. While it was traditionally believed that rituals arose out of myths, scholars are now increasingly understanding that while myths and rituals share some commonality, it cannot be said that one developed out of the other. This theory will be studied in detail, and while we will understand the historical development of the subject, we will also come to realize that many rituals are practiced all over the world that may not be a part of any mythical tradition, for example, singing the Happy Birthday song, or carnivals and parades to mark the national patriotic holidays. While myths wish to create a possible answer to the creation of the world, rituals interpret the way or functions we can perform to sustain ourselves in that world. This helps us as individuals to grow both mentally strong and realize that we belong to a strong cultural identity. We can say that rituals are cultural practices while myths are an integral part of the religious and historical identity of a community or a group of people. This unit will thus determine the above points further in greater detail. 2.2 Myth Ritual Theory, Chronological Development. William Robertson Smith, 1846 to 1894, was amongst the first few scholars who tried to define the relationship between myths and rituals. He put his preference for rituals and laid emphasis on how rituals influenced its followers and others, and how it looked primarily at the social, sociological aspects of cultures and societies. For Smith and his supporters, myths are important primarily because they tell us something about the social organization, i.e., kinship, customs, practices, etc. This importance of myths is recognized in other disciplines of studies such as anthropology, ethnography, ecology, folkloristics, and other domains of social sciences as an area of scientific inquiry. In the late 1880s, due to the impact created from the deliberations of Smith and his followers, many books on anthropology and ethnography were published with chapters especially focusing on belief systems, rites, rituals, and customs of different societies. These specifically studied how rituals are interpreted to estimate their relevance in the social life of the people. Franz Boas, 1858 to 1942, the father of American anthropology, also made a similar attempt to specify a line of distinction between myths and tales, 1916, 31. However, this did not gain much success, as the issue of distinguishing between myths and ordinary or folk tales has so many shades that it has been an area of an utter puzzle for scholars across generations. This problem is clearly recognized by Bronislaw Malinowski, 1884 to 1942, a functionalist. A part of his famous book, Argonauts of the Western World, Malinowski, 1922, deals with myths and rituals of cooler exchange, i.e., coolering. This is a ceremonial exchange system conducted in the Milne Bay province of Papua New Guinea. Malinowski believed that these myths represent a pragmatic charter or a set of rules, a set of codes of conduct that enable the social functions of the culture to flourish. The myth comes into play when a rite, ceremony, or a social or moral rule demands justification, warrant of antiquity, reality, and sanctity. Based on this conviction, Malinowski tries to distinguish between the two types of tales that he encountered in the Trobriand Islands. Malinowski, 1926, 18-19. He determined them in the following manner. 1. Type 1. Fairy tales and legends that are told for amusement. These are primarily viewed as a social statement intended to satisfy social ambition. 2. Type 2. Myth is a reality lived by the people. It is not symbolic, but a direct expression of its subject matter. It is not an explanation in satisfaction of scientific interest, but a narrative resurrection of a primeval reality. This distinction, as designed by Malinowski, stands in great contrast to the views of Smith. Malinowski argues that myths offer justification for social beliefs and are intimately associated with rituals in an inverted order of importance. Even if rituals do come first, myths are necessary to comprehend their meaning and true function. If rituals form a reenactment of the events that are considered to have happened in another reality, myths are necessary to place individuals and the society or the culture itself within that reality. To explicate the nature and importance of myths, Malinowski identifies three different types of myths. 1. Ancient myths. They describe events that occur when the earth is being inhabited from the underworlds, and they are related to the origin of the first human beings, clans, and villages, as well as the relationship between this world and any future world. 2. Culture myths. They relate to ogres and cannibals, as well as to the human beings that institute certain customs and ceremonies. They relate to the events when human beings already inhabit the earth, and when the social customs are already established. 3. Ordinary myths. Myths in which only ordinary human beings appear. These human beings do have some extraordinary powers, e.g., magical, supernatural, God-gifted, and these stories describe the origins of witchcraft, love potions, flying canoes, flying snakes, etc. If we investigate the scheme of classification quite critically, we can notice that many myths may fall within two or even all these types, and the distinctions between them are not always clear and they cannot be categorized. Stories from the past possess an element of universality, which contributes to the normative function of myths. Therefore, anthropologists, ethnologists, and folklorists have emphasized on the ritual action itself. This prominence given, however, is mostly taken for granted, and myths and rituals are studied together, without any clear attempt to clarify their relationship. Clyde Clughorn, 1905-1960, tried to clarify this relationship between myth and rituals. In his article published in 1942, Clughorn elaborates on the connection between ritual and myth and recognizes the role of psychoanalytic insights within the bond. His hypothesis claims that mythology is mainly a description of rituals. Clughorn, 1942. However, he also points to difficulties of making a clear distinction between myths, legends, and fairy tales. He, therefore, considers a definition of myth as a sacred tale. This is unsatisfactory as there is a lack of direct association with rituals. While there are cultures that associate myths and rituals and recognize the interlinkages between them, there are others that do not. It is necessary to recognize the intricate interdependence between the myths and rituals, as it makes an important observation on social behavior. To question this connectedness would be wrong. Clughorn is against any kind of simplistic statement or generalization, and according to him, as there are no practical methods to establish the primacy of one or the other, one should determine the general tendencies between the two within a specific culture. This tendency depends on several specific cultural traits, as well as on the individual responses to these traits. Going further, he argues for psychology-influenced theories that help to conclude that myths and rituals equally facilitate the adjustment of an individual to society. Both myth and ritual have a common psychological basis. Hence they are supra-individual. Both these are cultural products and are parts of the social heredity of a society. Kluckhohn, 1942-79. Going further, the idea of both myth and ritual as cultural products was developed by Edmund Leach, 1910-1989. He does not attempt to define ritual within a set standard, except the ones that are as a system of symbolic communication. He provides some specific contextual situations where rituals are observed in different societies. In this approach, Leach attempts to reconcile divergent views represented by Durkheim and Malinowski. The solution to determine these interlinkages, according to him, determines a ritual as something related to technique just as sacred is related to profane. He goes further to assert that they do not denote types of action but are indicative of any kind of action. Ritual, for Leach, is a symbolic statement that says something about the individuals involved in the action. Leach, 1954-13. Myth is a counterpart of ritual. Myth implies ritual. Ritual implies myth. They are one and the same. Hence, Leach consciously moves away from the hypothesis that sees classical doctrine in social anthropology to claim that myth and ritual are conceptually separate entities that perpetuate one another through functional interdependence. He postulates the rite as a dramatization of the myth as, therefore, the sanction or charter for the rite. Myth, according to him, says the same thing as ritual regarded as a statement in action. He goes further to say, to ask questions about the content of belief, which are not contained in the content of ritual is nonsense. Leach, 1954, 13-14. From a theoretical point of view, Leach represents a radical break with functionalism and takes an important step towards the structural interpretations of myth. For Leach, myths are one of the ways of describing certain types of human behavior. On the other hand, ritual action and belief are similar as they both form a symbolic statement about the social order. This becomes possible because rituals, in their cultural contexts, have patterns of symbols, and they can be determined to have the same structure as the other pattern of symbols. This structure, therefore, is the system of socially approved, proper relations between individuals and groups. However, we must add here that although this system is not always practically recognized, members of the society are reminded of the underlying structure of the myths. This provides the framework for all their social activities. As Leach rightly determines, ritual performances have this function. For the participating group as a whole, they momentarily make explicit what is otherwise a fiction. Leach, 1954-16. Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1908-2009, on the other hand, announced the entrance of structuralism to the study and analysis of myths. In his article, Anthropologie Structurale in 1958, he puts forward that one's study should proceed directly from the apparent contradictions that myths pose to us. He recognizes that myths are another type of communication, being quite like other verbal and non-verbal communications that are prevalent in every society, primitive or modern. In fact, he recognizes a clear connection between myths and language, since myths are expressed through language. Following the lines of earlier scholars such as Ferdinand de Saussure, Nikolai Trubetskoy, 1890-1938, Roman Jakobson, 1896. 1982, and Louis Hjelmslev, 1899-1965, Lévi-Strauss recognizes myth as another system of science which can be interpreted in a similar way as done for language. He opines that since myth, just like language, is made of constitutive units, these units presuppose the constituent units present in language when analyzed on other levels, namely, phonemes, morphemes, and sememes, but they, nevertheless, differ from the latter in the same way as the latter differ among themselves. They belong to a higher and a more complex order. Lévi-Strauss, 1958, 211. He calls these units my themes. It is only through the analysis of the relations of Different my themes, whose structure remains in the unconscious mind, that we can understand the meaning of a myth. Guided to understand in this way, we can say that myth, using Sushoyan terminology, should serve as a kind of an alechronic device that can bridge the gap between the synchronic and diachronic perspectives. While studying Levi-Strauss, Bockovich says there presents three different methods for analyzing a myth, in terms of the reversible or irreversible character of the sequences present in it, b. in terms of the tests of commutability, and c. myth considered as a thought ritual, which is submitted to a direction which is in some way natural and emerges from the analysis of ritual considered as enacted. Myth. Boscovich, 2002, 128. The third method provides a valuable verification of the results obtained by the other two. Unlike his predecessors, Levi-Strauss points at the fact that in many cases there is no proof of the interrelationship between myth and ritual. There is no myth underlying the ritual as a whole, and when foundation myths exist, they generally bear on details of the ritual which appear secondary or supernumerary. However, if myth and ritual do not mirror each other, they often reciprocally complete each other, and it is only by comparing them that one can formulate hypotheses on the nature of certain intellectual strategies typical of the culture under consideration. Levi-Strauss, 1958, 204. In a way, this brings us full circle in the consideration of the relationship between myth and ritual. For Levi-Strauss, this relationship is not a matter of great importance. He believes that we should start from myth to find the deeply embedded structures of thinking, which will enable us to explain and understand different types of behavior. Theoretically, any myth can be reenacted just by being spoken, narrated or written down. Hence, as far as the meaning of the myths and their interpretation is concerned, rituals become irrelevant. During the last half a century or so, scholars have begun to approach myths from different angles. Due to the impact of structuralism, the connection between myth and ritual and the primacy of one or the other has lost its importance. The main importance of the structuralist approach is that it shifts the focus of the methodology of dealing, i.e., transcribing, telling, reenacting, writing, remembering, etc., with myths to language. Myths are just stories, narratives, and should be regarded as such. Boscovich determines that just as all myths are stories, all stories are not myths. Boscovich, 1995. To achieve any understanding of the myths of a specific culture or society, it is necessary to take the linguistic or narrative turn to regard myths primarily as culture-specific narratives and employ all the elements of the analysis of narratives to the analysis of myths. This type of approach, however, is discussed and criticized by Joran Aimer, who considers myth as a ritual transported into the verbal sphere of life, where it may further develop into fiction and drama. Therefore, if we wish to understand myth and what myth is about, we must treat myth as ritual. Aimer, 1987, 21. The words of Leach are well echoed in the last sentence of his article. The cultural nature of ritual and myth. The nature of myth is the nature of ritual, and the nature of ritual is that of the cultural exploration of possible worlds. Aimer, 1987, 22, 2.3 Myth, Ritual and Religious Faith. The myth-ritual debate happened for the entire 20th century, Brunote, 2017. With the advent of interdisciplinary studies, it marks a turning point in the analysis of classical theories, and its epistemological focus moves from a text-centric approach to the recognition of social practices, performances, visual cultures, and material artifacts as useful mediators. At the beginning of the 1970s, two eminent religious scholars publicly offered two completely contrary approaches to the myth and ritual question. 1. In 1973, G.S. Kirk, 1921–2003, argues that it will be wise to reject from the outset the idea that myth and religion are twin aspects of the same subject, or parallel manifestations of the same psychic condition, just as firmly as we reject the idea that all myths are associated with rituals. 2. In 1979, W. Burkert, 1931–2015, developed a totally different position regarding the relation between mythology and ritual. He argues that the complex relation of myth and ritual, although not indissoluble, becomes a major force in forming ancient cultures. We can see those deep values of human tradition, where even today our experience tends to flow. While it is not yet clear how and in which context the notion of a close connection between myths, i.e., beliefs, creeds, and symbols, and rituals, i.e., action, cult, started to emerge, we can determine that for a period, myths were understood as autonomous, sometimes even as a literary edifice of narratives about gods, heroes, and chthonic, i.e., relating to or inhabiting the underworld, demons. The interest in rituals developed in Europe roughly at around the same time. Around the middle of the 19th century, scholars began to conduct empirical surveys in search of traces of belief in vegetation, grain, and wood spirits and related manners and customs. At the same time, the birth of interest is noted among scholars in the peculiar features of primitive cultures outside Europe. Salomon and Goldberg. 2012. Although comparative anthropologists create some temporal distance from the primitives through their stage model of evolutionism, the concepts of survivals and revivals imply a rather vague concomitant. 2.3.1 Myth Ritual inside the religious faith. In a few introductory pages of his lectures on the religion of the Semites, William Robertson Smith introduces the myth ritualist theory, Smith 1889. He begins by warning against the anachronistic modern habit of looking at religion from the side of belief rather than of practice. Instead of first looking for the creed that provides the key to ritual and practice, he argues, we should do the reverse. First find the ritual, which unlocks the creed. Rightly, we should not even expect to find a creed, for the antique religions, i.e., ancient and primitive, have for the most part no creed, they consist entirely of institutions and practices. Smith grants that ancient and primitive people doubtlessly performed rituals for some reasons. There is no doubt that societies do not habitually follow certain practices without attaching a meaning to them. However, he claims that the meaning is secondary and can even fluctuate. As a rule, it is found that while the practice is rigorously fixed, the meanings attached to it can vary, and the same rite is interpreted differently by individuals. As a result, orthodoxy or heterodoxy arising. In consequence, we can say that rituals are more important in ancient religion than the myths. Mythology is not an essential part of an ancient religion, for it has no sacred sanction and no binding force on the worshippers. The myths connected with individual sanctuaries and ceremonies are merely part of the apparatus of the worship. They serve to excite the fancy and sustain the interest of the worshippers. But they are often offered a choice of several accounts of the same thing, and, provided that they fulfill the ritual with accuracy, no one cares what their beliefs about its origin. Therefore, mythology does not take prominence, especially when we are assigned to it in the scientific study of ancient faiths. Sir James George Fraser, 1854–1941, goes further to develop the myth ritual theory beyond William Smith. Fraser presents two distinct versions of myth ritualism. A. In the first version, the myth describes the life of the god of vegetation, and ritual enacts the myth describing his death and rebirth. The ritual operates based on the law of similarity, according to which the imitation of action causes it to happen. The ritual directly manipulates the god of vegetation, but as the god goes, so automatically the vegetation goes. The ritual is performed when a clan wants winter to end, presumably when stored up provisions are running low. A human being, often the king, plays the role of the god and acts out what he magically induces the god to do. B. In the second version, the king is central. Here the king does not merely act the part of the god but is himself divine. The god resides in him. Just as the health of vegetation depends on the health of its god, so now the health of the god depends on the health of the king. As the king goes, so goes the god of vegetation, and so, in turn, goes vegetation itself. 2. Ensure a steady supply of food, the community kills its king while he is still in his prime and thereby safely transfers the soul of the god to his successor. The aim is to end winter, which now is attributed to the weakening of the king. while the second version of myth ritualism proves to be more influential by far. It provides only a tenuous link between myth and ritual. Instead of enacting the myth of the god of vegetation, the ritual simply changes the residence of the god. The king dies not in imitation of the death of the god but as a sacrifice to preserve the health of the god. What part of the myth plays here, is it not easy to see? Instead of reviving the god by magical imitation, the ritual revives the god by a transplant. 2.3.2 Myth ritual outside religious faith. Outside religion, the most notable application of the myth ritual theory is noted in the literature. The English classicist Jane Harrison, 1850–1928, argues that all art, not just literature, is derived from ritual. Using Fraser's first version of myth ritualism, she speculates that gradually people cease believing that the imitation of action causes that action to occur. Yet rather than abandoning ritual, they now practice it as an end. Ritual for its own sake becomes an art, e.g., drama. She thus follows the line envisaged by Harrison, Gilbert Murray, 1866–1957, and Francis M. Cornford, 1874–1943, who put the Greek epics, tragedies, and comedies within the frame of myth ritualism. Murray extends this theory to include the works of William Shakespeare. Most of the literary critics of myth ritualism are indeed concerned less with the myth itself than with the mythic origin of literature. The works of literature are interpreted as the outgrowth of myths once tied to rituals. For those literary critics indebted to Fraser, literature harks back to Fraser's second myth ritualist scenario. For literary myth ritualists, myth becomes literature only when myth is severed from ritual. Myth tied to ritual is religious literature, myth cut off from ritual is secular literature or plain literature. Bereft of ritual, myth can no longer change the world and is demoted to mere commentary. An element of literature. Clyde Cluckhorn was amongst the first scholars who tempered the dogma that myths and rituals are inseparable. Walter Burkert, 1979, goes well beyond Cluckhorn in not merely permitting but assuming the original independence of myth and ritual. He maintains that when the two come together, they do not just serve a common function, but reinforce each other. Myth bolsters ritual by giving mere human behavior a real, not to mention divine, origin. It does this because the gods did or do it. Conversely, ritual bolsters myth by turning a mere story into prescribed behavior of the most dutiful kind. It does this on pain of anxiety, if not punishment. Myth not only serves ritual, but ritual also equally serves myth. For Burkert, ritual is not the customs and formalities involved in actual hunting, but dramatized hunting. The function is no longer that of securing food, for the ritual proper arises only after farming has supplanted hunting as the prime source of food. The communal nature of actual hunting, and ritualized hunting, thereafter function to assuage anxiety over one's own aggression and mortality, and at the same time function to cement a bond among participants. It may be assumed that this shift of focus from the physical world to the human world typifies the shift of focus from 19th century theories of myth to 20th century ones. 2.4 Myth and Ritual, Conceptual Correlation. Among the many theories of myth and many theories of ritual, the myth and ritual theory is distinctive in the process of connecting myths to rituals. The myth and ritual or myth ritualist theory maintains that myths and rituals operate together. The theory claims not the myths and rituals happen to go together but that they must. In its most uncompromising form, the theory contends that myths and rituals cannot exist without each other. In a milder form, the theory asserts that myths and rituals originally exist together but may subsequently go their separate ways. In a still milder form of the theory, myths and rituals can arise separately but subsequently coalesce. Siegel, 1997, 2. Scholars often emphasize on the distribution of myths as well as upon the mythological patterning which prevailed in different cultures and culture areas. The study of these distributions leads to a generalization of another order which is the converse of the hypothesis of most 19th century classical scholars that a ritual is an enactment of a myth. While this suggestion of the primacy of ritual Over myth may be a valid statistical induction and a proper statement of the modal tendency of evidence. It is a simple unitary explanation as to the generally rejected 19th century views. One can present several instances in which the evidence is unequivocal that myths did give rise to ritual. 2.4.1 Dream in myth formation. Personal dreams can have a role in myth formation. It can arise from a dream or a waking fantasy or a personal habit system of some individual in a society. The basic psychological mechanisms involved seem not dissimilar to those whereby individuals in different cultures construct private rituals or carry out private divination, e.g., counting and guessing before the clock strikes, trying to get to a given point, a traffic light, for instance, before something else happens. There are instances to suggest and explain that personal rituals have been taken over and socialized by the group. Literature is full of instances of persons dreaming that supernatural beings summoned them, conduct them on travels or adventures, and admonish them thereafter to carry out certain rites, often symbolically repetitive of adventures. Also, researchers present much plausible evidence to confirm that dreams are the source of new rituals. Delusions and dreams are so vivid and carry such conviction that any attempt to reason about them afterwards based on conscious sense impressions is unavailing. Such experiences deeply condition the individual, sometimes so deeply that if the experience is at variance with a tribal or neighborhood belief, the individual will retain his own variation. There can be no doubt that this is a very significant means of modifying a culture. However, where dreaming is accepted as revelation, it should not be assumed that the content and structure of a new myth and its derived ceremony are altogether determined by pre-existent cultural forms. The structure of new cultural forms, whether myths or rituals, is undoubtedly conditioned by the pre-existent cultural matrix. When changed conditions happen to make a particular type of obsessive behavior or a special sort of fantasy generally congenial, the private ritual is socialized by the group. The fantasy of the individual becomes the myth of his society. 2.4.2 Myth as moral reinforcement. Myth among the many primitive communities acts as a justification, as a rationale for ritual behavior, and as a moral reinforcement for other customary behaviors. It also plays a role not dissimilar to that of literature, especially sacred literature. In many literate cultures, their very familiarity increases their efficacy for, in a certain broad and loose sense, the function of both myths and rituals in the discharge of the emotion of individuals in socially accepted channels. Emotion is assisted by the repetition of words that have acquired a strong emotional coloring, and this coloring again is intensified by repetition. Myths are usually expective and repetitive dramatizations. Their role is like that of books in those cultures which have a few such reading texts. While such texts are scarce, their meaningfulness can be seen like the effect the tragedies or tragic plays had on the Greek populace. We have evidence from various cultures to show where myths have justified rituals and have appeared to be, after the fact, of ritual. We also have cases where new myths have given rise to new rituals. In other words, the primary conclusion which may be drawn from the data is that myths and rituals tend to be very intimately associated and to influence each other. What is the explanation of the observed connection between the two? The explanation may be found in the circumstance that myth and ritual satisfy a group of identical or closely related needs of individuals. We have seen how myths and rituals are adaptive from the point of view of the society in that they promote social solidarity, enhance the integration of the society by providing a formalized statement of its ultimate value attitudes, afford a means for the transmission of much of the culture with little loss of content, thus protecting cultural continuity and stabilizing the society. Since myth and ritual are rewarding in the daily lives of individuals, people need to preserve them. Myth and ritual continue to prevail at the expense of more rational responses of individuals. This general theory of myth and ritual as providing a cultural storehouse of adjustive responses for individuals is regarded as a functional form of myth-ritual coexistence. 2.5 Myth and ritual, mutual dependency. Here we must see an intricate interdependence of myth with ritual and many other forms of behavior. Going further, we must determine myths not as being simple curiosities, but as living, important elements in the day-to-day lives of people. Some features seem to be an explanation of natural phenomena. There are some ideas in both myths and rituals that reveal the wish-fulfillment roles of the culture. Some myths are intimately related to rituals. While some are descriptive, other myths stand apart. They are descriptions of rituals of the social organization. Accordingly, they are in essence the symbolic representations of the dominant configurations and standard conventions of the culture. Myths express not only the latent content of rituals but of other culturally organized behaviors. The agreement must be that mythological narratives and mythological concepts should not be equalized, for social, psychological, and historical conditions affect in different ways the need for a scrupulous inquiry into historical and other determinants must not be prevented to justify attempts to inquire into the symbolic processes of an important covert culture. At all events, the factual record is perfectly straightforward, hence neither myth nor ritual can be postulated as primary. Myths are constantly used to justify rituals. This observation is quite congruent with the observed facts in many cultures. Indeed, all of this data may be used toward a still wider induction that man, as a symbol using animal, appears to feel the need not only to act but equally to give verbal or other symbolic reasons for his acts. The vital significance of the myth is that it is a genre that works for cultural practices. In the case of both ritual and myth, the sentiments expressed in them are essential to the existence of society. This hypothesis can be regarded as having been well established, despite us lacking detailed observations on the change in myths as well changes in ritual and the differences observed in culture. Many cultural materials give certain hints that when culture changes rapidly, its myths are also substantially and quickly altered. Kluckhohn, 1942-78. Hence, we agree with Malinowski's notion of myth as an active force related to almost every aspect of a culture. Myth is a constant byproduct of the living faiths of the society striving for the need of miracles, of a sociological status demanding precedent of the moral rule which requires sanction. Both myth and ritual are symbolic procedures and are most closely tied together. The myth is a system of word symbols, whereas ritual is a system of objects and acting upon those symbols. Both are symbolic processes that refer to the same situation in similar manners. In both sacred and secular spheres, myths give some fixity to the ideal patterns of cultures not attained by the printed word. The existence of rituals has a similar effect. Therefore, there can be no doubt about the fact that both myths and rituals are important agencies in the transmission of a culture. They also prevent drastic cultural change. The facts enumerated here do not permit any universal generalizations to ritual being the cause of myth or vice versa. Their relationship is of intricate mutual interdependence. This is being differently structured in different cultures and differs from varying time periods in the same culture. There is great variation in the extent to which mythology conditions and the religious beliefs make the myth-ritual relationship complex. For example, myth plays a small role in Africa, but has much greater importance in religion in some parts of America. Both myth and ritual satisfy the needs of society, and the relative place of one or the other depends upon the needs, conscious and unconscious, of the individuals. The observed data shows that rituals are borrowed without their myths, and myths without any accompanying ritual. A ritual may be reinforced by a myth, or vice versa, in the donor culture but satisfy the carriers of the recipient culture simply as a form of activity. In short, the only uniformity which can be posited is that there is a strong tendency for some sort of interrelationship between myth and ceremony, and that this interrelationship is dependent upon what appears to be an invariant function of both myth and ritual. The gratification of a large proportion of people in society is based on the cohabitation of both myths and rituals. 2.6 Impact of myth-ritual cohabitation. Both myth and ritual provide cultural solutions to problems that all human beings face. To a large extent, we can say that culture is an effort to give the future safety by making activity repetitive. Hence, we are expected to make the future predictable by making it conform to the past. From this angle, our scientific mythology is related to that motivation as is the obsessive, the compulsive tendency which lurks in all organized thought. By nature, every human dread both spontaneity and change. He is a worshipper of habit in all its forms. Conventions and institutions are merely organized and sanctified habits. These are the real gods of human society, which transcend and outlive all other gods. All of them originate as group expedients, having social value, while remaining the objects of adoration despite them having outlived their usefulness. Men will continue to fight and die for them. They have their high priests, their martyrs, and their rituals. They are the working gods, the ostensible ones, a organized behavior, while men dread both spontaneity and change in most of their activities. However, a careful examination of the totality of their behavior and of someone who is not confined in an institution, or who has not withdrawn almost completely from participation in the society, will show that his behavior is habitual. Hence, a socialized individual is an organism that behaves mostly in a predictable manner. This is phrased as conformity, and the existence of an individual in an organized society is unthinkable unless the people behave in the expected manner. Keeping this surmise in our mind, we can say that rituals constitute a guarantee in certain societally organized behaviors, as they touch upon certain areas of ignorance, which constitute tender spots. For all human beings, people can count upon the repetitive nature of the phenomena of the rituals. Accordingly, rituals and myths supply fixed points in a world of bewildering change. b. Persistence of habit systems. Ritual activities originally conceived as instrumental are transmuted in processes embedded in themselves. The original purposes are often forgotten, and ritualistic adherence to institutionally prescribed conduct becomes obsessive. Such ritualism is associated with mythology which rationalizes these actions so that they appear to retain their conformity and status as a set means. However, the dominant pressure is in the direction of strict ritualistic conformity, irrespective of the rationalizations of man. In this sense, ritual proceeds further when such rationalizations are not even called forth. Neurologists also recognize a neurological basis for the persistence of such habit systems. For them, the organism tends to function in the accustomed manner. If a moderately effective performance can be achieved in this way, performances must be rewarded in the day-to-day lives of participating individuals. Sheer repetition sometimes assures the persistence of any habit. Hence, no myths and rituals will ever become extinct except when a whole society becomes extinct. It is necessary for us, therefore, to recognize the special conditions of drive and of rewards that myths and rituals offer. C. Reduction of anticipated disaster. Human beings are motivated by their physical needs that are felt. Hence, the anticipation of such pressures and by those habits that are acquired and reinforced reduces the fear of an impending disaster. Myths and rituals are reinforced because they reduce the anticipation of disaster. All living people have seen others die. Hence, our experience teaches us that these are potential threats to our health or happiness. D. Emotional reinforcement. There is some reinforcement for spectators and for all who wish to hear of recoveries. The patient expects to be relieved. Therefore, the very onset of chance produces some lessening of emotional tension, some reduction of anxiety. Recurrence of emotional stress tends to be accompanied by a repetition of acts. If the recurrence is sufficiently frequent, the form of the reaction becomes a habit to be repeated on similar occasions. Even where the stress is less vivid or almost absent, it can hardly be doubted that many rites owe their existence to such reactions. The more obvious functions are expressed in providing individuals with the possibility of enhancing personal prestige through a display of memory, histrionic ability, etc. Myths, hence, supply abundant materials for introjections and likewise, in the form of witchcraft myths. These suggest an easy and culturally acceptable method of introjections of hostile impulses. Rituals provide ways of sublimation of aggression and other socially disapproved tendencies by giving people something to do. Clughorn, 1942, 71, A. Solidarity of Community Sentiment. The recital of or reference to the myths reaffirms the solidarity of strong community sentiment. Knowing a good story can protect the home, children, and property of community members. A myth is just like a big stone foundation, it lasts a long time. Performance of rituals heightens awareness of the common sentiments of societies. The ceremonials also bring individuals together in a situation where quarreling is forbidden for the time being. Preparation for and carrying out of performance demands intricately ramified cooperation, economic and otherwise, and accordingly, it reinforces a sense of mutual dependency. Thus, myth and ritual equally facilitate the adjustment of the individual to his society. Moreover, they provide a means of sublimation of his anti-social tendencies. It is not without meaning that essentially some myths and rituals take societies and their troubles within them as a point of departure. F. Protection from supernatural dangers. The concept of the working God confirms the sanctified repetitive ways of behavior. If a god is offended by a violation of the culture's system of scruples, some ceremonials act as institutionalized means of restoring the individual to full rapport with the universe. Nature protects the individual in his society. The associated myths reinforce the person's belief that the ceremonials truly cure him of his illness and will also change him so that he becomes a better man in his relations with his family and his neighbors. The culture prescribes not only the supernatural dangers but also the supernatural means of meeting these dangers or of alleviating their effects. Myths and rituals jointly provide systematic protection against supernatural dangers, the threats of ill health and the physical environment, antisocial tensions, and the pressures of a more powerful society. In the absence of codified law and of an authoritarian chief or their other substitute, it is only through the myth-ritual system that members' community can make a socially supported, unified response to all of these disintegrating threats. Thus, the all-pervasive configurations of word symbols, myths, and act symbols, rituals, preserve the cohesion of the society and sustain the individual, protecting him from intolerable conflict. 2.6 Summary. The relationship between myth and ritual remains a matter of dispute even today. Modern scholars assume that one should be studied with full reference to the other. If we ask someone while that person is performing some ritual why he or she is doing it, we shall get the answer, because I believe in this and that. This kind of questioning, while providing a relational link between myth and ritual, leads to fabricating a relational interface that is essentially tautological and uninformative. Many rituals, even those repetitive ones, are grounded in the social and psychological aspects of societies, not in myths or beliefs. The fact that myths are narratives is of primary importance. It is the institution of the relationship between the present and the past. This relationship is essentially a static and one-sided one. Whenever it is necessary, or simply convenient, the past is being recalled. Cohen, 1969, 349. Alternatively, it may be said that the past is constantly being reenacted in the present with numerous alterations, but with the basic structure remaining the same. The debate, myths and rituals form itself as a form of ritual with the purpose of establishing the connection with the past and the theories that have dominated for centuries. The specific adaptive and adjustive responses performed by myth and ritual can be differently phrased in different societies according to the historical experiences acquired by the societies, including the specific opportunities they have had for borrowing from other cultures, in accordance with prevalent configurations of other aspects of the culture, and with reference to pressures exerted by other societies and by the physical and biological environment. But the general nature of the adaptive and adjustive responses performed by myth and ritual appears very much the same in all human groups. Hence, although the relative importance of myth and ritual does vary greatly, the two tend universally to be associated. Myth and ritual have a common psychological basis. Ritual is an obsessive, repetitive activity, often a symbolic dramatization of the fundamental needs of the society, whether economic, biological, social, or sexual. Mythology is the Rationalization of these same needs, whether they are all expressed in overt, ceremonial or not. It confirms the popular adage that every culture has a type of conflict and a typical solution. Ceremonials tend to portray a symbolic resolvent of the conflicts which external environment, historical experience, and selective distribution of personality type have caused to be characteristic in the society. It is equally important to note that myths and rituals, although surviving as functioning aspects of a coherent culture if they meet the needs of several concrete individuals, are in one sense, supra-individual. They are usually composite creations. They normally embody the accretions of many generations, modifications, through borrowing from other cultures or by intra-cultural changes, which the varying needs of the group as a whole and of innovating individuals in the group have imposed. In short, both myths and rituals are cultural products and are parts of the social heredity of a society. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.